The first sound Dr. Mara Ose heard was not the crash. It was the silence right before it, the half-second when every monitor in the ER seemed to hold its breath at once, as if the building itself knew something was coming. Then the sky over the parking lot turned white, and the windows shook, and the silence broke into alarms. 3 minutes earlier, it had been an ordinary Tuesday night shift. Mara had been stitching a laceration on a teenager who'd argued with a chain-link fence and lost, half listening to a resident named Priya complain about the vending machine eating her dollar for the third time that week. Ordinary complaints, ordinary injuries, the comfortable churn of a city hospital at 11 p.m. Then the lights flickered, the fire alarm tripped for no reason anyone could find, and a security guard came sprinting through the double doors shouting that something had come down in the north lot, that it was burning, that nobody should go near it. Mara went near it anyway. It was, she would tell people later, the single least professional decision of her career, and she has never regretted it. The object in the parking lot was not a plane and not a car, though it had crushed 3 of each getting there. It was long and curved, the color of wet slate, and steam rose off it in thin curling ropes even though there was no fire. A seam had cracked open along its underside, and out of that seam came a sound Mara had heard 1,000 times in the NICU. The thin, furious, unmistakable cry of something small trying to announce that it was alive. She did not think about protocol. She did not think about the 2 security guards yelling for everyone to stay back, or the fact that the object had fallen out of the sky 40 minutes after the news had reported an unexplained flash over the coast. She thought about the sound, the way she always did, the way 20 years of medicine had trained her spine to move before her mind finished catching up. She climbed through the crack in the hull. Inside, it was warmer than it had any right to be, and dimly lit by a soft blue glow with no visible source. 2 small forms lay in a padded recess, tangled together the way infants tangle when they've had no one else to hold on to. They were not human. Mara registered that fact and set it aside in the same motion, the way she'd once set aside the fact that a gunshot patient was a man she recognized from the news. There would be time to be astonished later. Right now there was only the fact of 2 small bodies, unmoving where they should have been squirming, and a readout on the wall beside them blinking in a red that needed no translation to mean failing. She got them out. She never fully remembered how, only that her hands had known what to do with the restraints even though she had never seen a restraint like them, and that by the time she was climbing back through the crack with one against each hip, security had stopped shouting at her and simply stood there, staring. "Call it in," she told them, striding past. "Tell them I've got 2 pediatric patients, critical, unknown trauma. I need Bay 4 cleared now." Nobody argued. Nobody, in that moment, was thinking clearly enough to argue. Bay 4 was not built for what came through its doors. Mara worked anyway. The 2 infants, she would not let herself call them anything else, not aliens, not specimens, not any of the words already forming in the mouths of the staff gathering at the glass, had skin with a faint gray-green cast and a texture like fine suede. Where a human infant would have 10 fingers, they had 8, longer and more delicate, tipped in something that wasn't quite nail and wasn't quite claw. Their eyes, when one of them finally cracked them open to stare up at her, were a deep amber gold, slit-pupilled, and entirely unmistakably frightened. Their vitals made no sense on human equipment. Their heart rate, assuming that fluttering under the ribs was a heart, ran nearly triple what a human infant's would, and dropping. Mara made a decision in about 4 seconds that she would later describe to a review board as the only one that made sense at the time, and started treating them exactly as she would treat any critically unstable newborn: warmth, fluid, oxygen, and watching. She adjusted for the speed of that pulse. She adjusted for a temperature that ran 4 degrees warmer than a human's should. She improvised, the way doctors improvise when the textbook has nothing to offer and a patient is dying in front of them regardless. By 2 in the morning, both infants were breathing steadily, wrapped in warmed blankets under a heat lamp meant for burn victims, and Mara had not left the room once. That was when the first man in a gray suit arrived, flashing a badge too fast for anyone to read, saying words like national security and containment protocol, and Mara, still in blood and soot-streaked scrubs, running on adrenaline and 4 hours of sleep from 2 nights ago, did something that would define the rest of her life. She stood in the doorway of Bay 4 and told him no. "They're my patients," she said. It was the only sentence she had, and she said it like a woman building a wall out of bricks she was making as she went. I don't care what agency you're from. I don't care what's in that lot. Until I know what's keeping these two alive, they don't leave this hospital, and they don't leave my sight. The man in the suit, he would introduce himself eventually reluctantly as Agent Colton Reyes, looked at her the way people look at something they haven't been trained to categorize. Then he looked past her, at the two small shapes under the heat lamp, and something in his face shifted, just slightly, from procedure to something more uncertain. "Doctor," he said, "you have no idea what you've just picked up." "No," Mara agreed. "But I know what happens to patients nobody advocates for. I've watched it happen. I'm not doing it again." She did not know in that moment that she had just quoted, almost word for word, a law that existed nowhere on Earth, one that had not been invoked in 11 centuries, one that would, within the month, make her name known on worlds she couldn't yet locate on a star chart. She only knew that the small amber eyes watching her from the recovery bed had stopped looking quite so frightened, and that felt, for now, like enough. The days that followed blurred into a routine unlike anything Mara had built her career around, though it borrowed the shape of it. She falsified nothing exactly. She was too careful, too aware of her own license, for that. But she used every gray area a teaching hospital afforded her. The infants went onto the books as unidentified minors, trauma admission, pending identification. She pulled favors from a NICU nurse named Denise who had delivered exactly 0 questions and exactly all of the necessary formula substitutes, cobbled together from amino acid profiles Mara reverse-engineered from blood work that came back from the lab looking like a printing error. Agent Reyes did not go away. He came back the next night, and the night after, always polite, always patient, always circling the same request with different words. The children needed to be moved somewhere secure. Somewhere with resources she didn't have. Somewhere he wouldn't specify, which was, to Mara, the entire problem. "You keep saying secure," she told him on the 4th night, checking a monitor that had finally started reading numbers she trusted. "You never say safe. They're not the same thing? Not in my experience." He didn't have an answer for that, and she noticed, filed it away the way she filed away every small tell in every difficult conversation, that he didn't try to manufacture one. It wasn't Reyes who worried her most. In the end, it was the man who came on the 6th day, dressed not in a suit but in expensive, deliberately unremarkable clothes, carrying a briefcase and a business card that named a biotech firm Mara had genuinely never heard of. He didn't ask to see the children. He asked, instead, about intellectual property, about first contact acquisition rights, about numbers with enough zeros in them that Mara had to read the offer twice to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding the decimal point. She had him escorted out by security. It was the first time in 6 days she'd raised her voice. The hospital administrator, a cautious man named Whitfield who had spent his career avoiding exactly this kind of attention, cornered her outside the cafeteria on day 7. Reporters had started calling. Someone had leaked a blurry photo of the crater in the parking lot, and a cable news cheerin had already coined a phrase, "miracle babies," that made Mara's jaw tighten every time she heard it repeated. "I need you to understand the position this puts the hospital in," Whitfield said, not unkindly, but with the particular exhaustion of a man who had signed up to manage budgets, not first contact. "Legal liability. Insurance. The federal government is asking questions I don't have answers to, and half of them are asking whether we're equipped to be answering them at all. We're the only ones who've kept them alive so far," Mara said. "That's the only answer that matters to me. It might not be your call to make much longer. It's my call until someone with a better one for these 2 specific patients steps forward," she said. "Not a better title. A better plan." Whitfield didn't have one. Nobody, it turned out, did. Not the federal agents circling with forms nobody had a category for, and not, as she would learn soon enough, the polished corporate scout who returned twice more that week with steadily larger numbers and steadily thinner patients. That night, alone in the on-call room with both infants asleep in a converted bassinet warm to their liking, she found herself talking to them the way she talked to every patient too young to understand her, not because they could follow the words but because the sound of a steady voice mattered more than its content. "Nobody's selling you," she told them. "Nobody's shipping you off to a lab, either. I don't know what you are. I don't know where you came from, but you're mine until somebody proves they've got a better claim, And I promise you that bar is high. The smaller of the two, she'd started calling them, privately Sun and Moon, for the faint markings above their brow ridges, opened one amber eye and looked at her for a long moment before closing it again, apparently satisfied. Mara did not know it, but 400 light-years away, a search that had been running for 3 years, powered by grief and fury in equal measure, had just picked up the first clean signal it had received since the day the pod launched. She also did not know that the signal had been picked up by more than one listener. It was Denise, the NICU nurse, who noticed the man first. A visitor's badge clipped to his jacket. A face too calm for someone loitering outside a restricted corridor at 3 in the morning. She mentioned it to Mara only in passing, the kind of detail a busy night shift usually lets slide. Mara almost let it slide too, until she walked past the man herself an hour later and felt something prickle at the base of her neck, an instinct honed by years of reading rooms full of people in crisis. He was watching Bay for the way a man watches a door he intends to go through, not the way a worried relative watches a door he's hoping opens with good news. She had security walk him out. He went without protest, without a word, which unsettled her more than any argument would have. When she asked the front desk for his sign-in information 20 minutes later, the name on the badge matched no visitor log, no employee file, and no security footage from the lobby camera he must have passed to reach the corridor at all. Agent Reyes, when she told him, went pale in a way 3 weeks of steady composure hadn't managed. "Describe him again," he said, already moving toward the security office. She did. He listened, jaw tight, and then told her, carefully, the way a man tells someone a truth he's been withholding for their own good, that the pod hadn't simply crashed. It had been fired at, in the moments before it entered Earth's atmosphere, by something his agency's instruments had tracked and lost in the same 90 seconds. Whoever had wanted the children dead 3 weeks ago on a world 400 light-years from here had apparently followed the trail all the way to this one. After that, Bay 4 had an armed guard around the clock, and Mara stopped sleeping in the on-call room and started sleeping, when she slept at all, in a chair pulled directly beside the bassinet. Nobody argued with her about it. Nobody tried. 3 nights later, the corridor lights flickered exactly the way they had the night the pod fell, and for one long, silent second, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath again. Nothing came through the door. The power steadied. But when Reyes reviewed the outage afterward, he found it had originated from a junction box that fed exactly one hallway in the entire building, and no other. He never told Mara what he thought that meant. He didn't have to. She had already doubled the guard herself, and started leaving the bassinet's heat lamp burning through every hour of every night. Less for warmth now than so she would never, for even a second, have to search for them in the dark. The Armada did not announce itself with fire. It came instead as a silence, the same way the crash had begun. Every phone in the city losing signal at once, every satellite feed blinking out for 4 uncanny minutes, the sky over the hospital darkening in a wide slow ring as something vast settled into low orbit and blotted out the stars behind it. Then, just as suddenly, everything came back. Phones, signal, light. Only the sky was different now. A shape hung there, silver and impossibly large, and beneath it, descending in absolute silence, came a much smaller craft, sleek as a blade, that touched down in the same parking lot the pod had destroyed 3 weeks before. Mara was in Bay 4 when the alert went out. She was still in Bay 4 20 minutes later, both infants held against her. One on each hip, the same as the night she'd carried them out of the wreckage, when the door opened and a figure stepped through that made every security officer in the hallway drop to one knee without seeming to decide to. The woman who entered was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in something that shimmered faintly like oil on water, and she stopped 3 feet from Mara as if she had walked into a wall. Her eyes, amber gold, slit-pupilled, exactly the eyes staring up at Mara from 2 small faces, did not move from the children. "SCI-FI?" the woman said, and it took Mara a moment to understand it wasn't a word so much as a sound breaking apart in a throat that hadn't allowed itself to make it in a very long time. "Anna." The infants, Sun and Moon, though Mara would learn within the hour that this was not remotely what their mother called them, went very still, then very loud, twisting toward the sound of that voice with a desperation that had nothing to do with fear. Mara did not let go of them. Not yet. Every instinct she had, professional and otherwise, told her that a joyful reunion and a hostile handoff could look identical for the first several seconds, and she had learned, 3 weeks ago, not to move faster than her judgment. "You're the mother," she said. "Not a question." "I am Vale, though," the woman answered, and something about the way the room's air seemed to change told Mara this was a title as much as a name, though she wouldn't learn the scope of it. Empress, last of a bloodline nearly erased in a single night by a rival who'd assumed no one would think to hide the heirs on a world with no space program, for several more days. "You are the one who kept them. I'm also the one whose hospital had a man standing outside that door 3 nights ago who didn't belong here," Mara said, before the Empress could say anything else. It was not how she had planned to open the conversation, but 3 weeks of watching a shadow circle her patience had left her with very little patience for formalities. "Someone tried to finish what your pursuers started. I want to know if that's over, or if I need to keep sleeping in a chair next to my patients." For the first time since she had entered the room, Vale's composure cracked. Not into distress, but into something colder and more dangerous. An anger so precisely controlled it was almost worse to witness than if she had shouted. She said something sharp in a language Mara didn't know, and one of the armored figures who had followed her turned and left without a word, moving faster than Mara had seen anyone move since the night the pod fell. "It is over," the Empress said when she trusted her voice again. "The one responsible for my children's exile did not expect them to survive the crash, and did not expect anyone foolish or brave enough to keep searching for them once they had. He is answering for both mistakes now." She looked at Mara with something that had shifted, in the space of that exchange, from wary gratitude into a far more personal debt. "You kept watch over them when I could not. I will not forget which nights those were. I'm the one who treated them," Mara said carefully. "Same as I'd treat anyone who came through those doors half dead and screaming." Something crossed Vale's face. Not offense, Mara realized with some surprise, but its opposite. Something closer to disbelief that such a plain explanation could be true. "There is a law," the Empress said slowly, as if testing whether Mara already knew it and was being modest. "Older than my line, older than the ones who tried to end it. Whoever preserves the heir without knowledge of the debt, without expectation of the return, becomes bound to that heir's house. Not as servant. Not as subject." She paused. "As family." Mara looked down at the 2 small faces now craning toward their mother, then back up at a woman who had clearly expected this moment to look like anything except a tired doctor standing her ground in a hospital bay. "I didn't do it for a law I've never heard of," Mara said. "I know," said Vale, though. "That is precisely why it applies." What followed was not war, though for several tense hours it had every shape of one. Agent Reyes arrived with more agents than Mara had ever seen in one hallway, none of them quite sure whether they were witnessing a rescue, an invasion, or a diplomatic incident that no protocol on Earth had been written to cover. The biotech man's business card, Mara later heard, resurfaced in a very different context. The Empress's security detail had apparently taken a specific and pointed interest in exactly who had tried to buy her children, and Mara chose not to ask what became of that conversation. But the loudest fight in Bay for that night was not between Earth and the Empire. It was between the Empress and her own instincts. Vale, though, wanted, plainly, to take her children and vanish back into that silver shape in the sky, to put 400 light-years and a wall of warships between her heirs and every enemy who had ever tried to end her line. Mara understood the impulse. She had felt its human-sized cousin every time a parent tried to sign a fragile newborn out of the NICU a day too early, terrified of the hospital and unable to see that the hospital was, for now, the safest place their child could be. "They're stable," Mara told her, for perhaps the 4th time. "But they're not what they were 3 weeks ago. Their bodies adapted to what I could give them here. If you take them straight into a ship built for adult physiology, you undo 3 weeks of work in about 3 hours. You question my ability to care for my own children." "I'm questioning whether your ship has a NICU," Mara said. "Not whether you love them." The Empress went very still at that, the particular stillness of someone unused to being corrected and finding, against her own expectation, that she wasn't angry about it. "You are either very brave," she said at last, "or entirely unaware of who you are speaking to." "Probably both," Mara admitted. "I generally am." For the first time since she'd stepped off her shuttle, Veil, those mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but stood adjacent to one. There was one more matter neither of them had raised aloud, though both had clearly been circling it. Veil, though, voiced it first, on the second evening, watching through the observation glass as one of her own medics ran a scanner over Corvy's small chest and frowned at readings that made no sense against imperial norms but perfect sense against the numbers Mara had spent 3 weeks compiling by hand. "They will not grow as my people grow," the Empress said. "Not entirely. Whatever kept them alive here has changed something in how their bodies will develop. My physicians tell me this. They do not agree on what it means." "It means they're going to be a little bit of both," Mara said. "That's not a flaw. That's just what happens when something survives somewhere it wasn't built for. I'd be more worried if 3 weeks of crisis medicine left no mark at all." "You say this so plainly. I've watched a lot of children turn out fine who weren't supposed to," Mara said. "Different isn't the same as broken. I'd have thought a woman who rules more worlds than I can count would already know that better than I do." Veil, though, didn't answer for a long moment. When she did, it wasn't agreement so much as something quieter, an admission she seemed almost startled to be making. "I have ruled a great many worlds," she said. "I have known remarkably few people willing to say a true thing to me simply because it was true." She glanced toward the glass again, toward her children sleeping under a heat lamp built for a species not their own. "It is, I think, why the law exists at all." They compromised, in the end, the way Mara had learned every impossible negotiation eventually compromises. In small, unglamorous steps neither side loved but both could survive. A medical team came down from the Empress's flagship, and for 2 days it worked alongside Mara's team, translating alien physiology into terms human medicine could track and human medicine's careful, patient methodology into terms the Empress's engineers grudgingly respected. Sun and Moon, whose real names, Mara learned, were Ithel and Corvy, though she was privately relieved when the Empress told her the human names could stay, that a rescuer's naming carried its own weight, stabilized fully on the 3rd day. On the 4th day, the Empress asked Mara to walk with her through the hospital garden. A request so ordinary it took Mara several seconds to recognize it as unusual coming from someone with an armada in low orbit. "There is a formality," Veil, though, said, when they'd found a bench neither of them particularly needed. "A title. It has not been given to anyone outside the Empire in 11 centuries, because there has been no one outside the Empire in 11 centuries who did what you did without knowing what it would cost or earn you." "I don't want a title," Mara said honestly. "I know," said the Empress. "That is, again, precisely why you are receiving one. Thresholdkin, the title turned out to mean, in the clumsy translation the Empire's linguists eventually settled on for human ears, a status less like nobility and more like an unbreakable, formally recognized debt of gratitude, carried not by Mara alone but by her species as a whole, whether humanity understood what it had been handed or not. Came with no ships, no armies, no wealth. It came, Veil, though, explained with something close to amusement, with an open door to a palace on a world Mara had never heard of, an obligation the Empire could never revoke, and, more immediately and more usefully, an explicit and enforceable guarantee that no government, corporation, or opportunist, human or otherwise, could lay a hand on Ithel or Corvy without answering to a fleet that had just spent 3 years learning exactly how far it was willing to go to protect them. Agent Reyes, listening from a respectful distance with the stunned expression of a man watching his entire briefing packet become obsolete in real time, would later admit that this was the point at which he stopped trying to manage the situation and started simply trying to keep up with it. Mara did not go to the palace, not right away. She went back to the ER because a hospital does not stop needing doctors just because one of them briefly became a diplomatic incident, and because, she told Veil, though, this plainly, the same directness that seemed to be the only currency the Empress fully trusted. She had built her whole life around the belief that showing up for the next patient mattered more than any title anyone hung on her afterward. But twice a month, a small silver shuttle set down quietly in the same lot where the pod had once burned a crater into the asphalt, and 2 small figures, steadier now, faster, already outpacing the growth charts Mara had built for them out of guesswork and stubbornness, came bounding across the pavement to find her. Veil, though, came with them most times. She had stopped, somewhere in those first months, treating the visits as diplomatic obligation and started, without ever quite admitting it aloud, treating them as something closer to what Mara had always called them without thinking twice about the word: family. On one such evening, watching Ethel chase a very patient hospital cat across the garden while Corvey solemnly explained to a bewildered resident why human hospital food was, in her expert 8-month-old opinion, unacceptable. Vale, though, asked the question she had clearly been circling for weeks. Why did you climb into a burning wreck for creatures you had never seen before, with no idea what waited inside? Mara considered the question the way she considered most things, slowly and out loud. Because something was crying, she said. And I've spent my whole life believing that's the only reason anyone needs. The Empress of a galaxy that stretched across more stars than Earth's telescopes had ever counted looked at the woman beside her. A woman with no fleet, no fortune, no power beyond a steady pair of hands and a refusal to be impressed by anything grand enough to make her forget what mattered, and understood, at last, exactly why the ancient law had never once, in 11 centuries, gotten it wrong. Somewhere behind them, Corvey finally cornered the hospital cat, delivered it a single triumphant chirp of a sound in a language no translator on Earth had a word for yet, and let it go without ever quite deciding what she'd meant to do once she caught it. Ethel abandoned the chase altogether to climb, with great seriousness, into the resident's lap and inform him, in the careful, mismatched English she was still assembling one borrowed word at a time, that she had decided he would be her friend now, whether he had agreed to it or not. The resident, to his credit, did not argue. Yes? Vale, though, said quietly, watching her children play beneath a sky they were slowly learning to call, at least in part, home. I believe you have.